Hi friends, I'm Red Stegall. I'm an entertainer, author, and proud Texas rancher. I'm inviting my fellow cattle ranchers to join me in the Alamo statewide stampede, a simple way to help preserve our Texas heritage. When you sell your livestock, just let the auction house know you'd like some or all of the proceeds to go to the Remember the Alamo Foundation. If you don't have livestock, no problem. You can still take part by making a donation. These tax-deductible donations will go directly to the Alamo Plan, which is preserving the Alamo for generations to come. And together we'll ensure we always remember the Alamo.
Stories Bigger Than Texas, the Alamo Podcast. 3 weeks after the stunning defeat at the Alamo, the Texas revolutionaries suffered another gut-wrenching loss. On this day, 189 years ago, March 27, 1836, hundreds of Texas soldiers were executed in what would become known as the Goliad Massacre. Today, we reveal the unease Mexican leaders felt before carrying out Santa Anna's execution orders, the heartbreaking hope the Texans felt right up until their deaths, and how Remember Goliad became forever linked to the battle cry, Remember the Alamo. I'm your host, Emily Balcom. We're joined by Scott McMahon, the director and historian for Presidio la Bahía, where key moments of the Goliad Massacre took place. Welcome back to the podcast.
Thanks for having me back. I appreciate it.
Last week, we talked about the operations you oversee at the Fannin Battleground. This week, we're focusing on the Presidio. For people who have never been to Goliad, it's about 90 miles southeast of the Alamo, not far from the Texas coastline. Tell us about the origins of Presidio la Bahía.
So the Presidio is initially founded because of the French incursions into Spanish Texas. So basically, when La Salle shows up in the late 1680s and establishes his fort below Victoria, or what would become Victoria, the Spanish find out about it and they're not happy. It's Spanish territory, so they send up an expedition. Now, this all moves very slowly, but from the 1680s, it takes them a little bit. But by 1721, they have established Presidio la Bahía, and they realize it's not the best location, so it moves a couple of times. It ends up in what is now Goliad in 1749. It's a great location for the fort. It's on a high point. You can see the countryside all around. Even if you go there today and stand up in the battlements, you can see around the countryside. It consists of a walled-in compound with barracks, officers' quarters. There is a chapel, Our Lady Loretto Chapel. There is a guard room, which is kind of one of the features. That early on, they start out as towers. But you step back and you look at the Presidio, you can see the footprint and the plans for a frontier Presidio like the Spanish envisioned.
Unlike the Alamo, it was built as a fort, not as a mission.
Yes, ma'am. It was never built as a mission. We do have a church. We have a chapel there within the walls. That chapel was for the soldiers, their families, and the people that lived in the village that grew up around the walls of the Presidio. We have a mission in Goliad, but the mission was built to convert and Christianize the local Indians. The Presidio Church was for the parishioners there in the area.
And if our listeners have never been, it is a stunning church. It's one of the oldest in the United States.
It is. It was started in 1776, took them 3 years to complete it, and it has been used almost continuously. There was a brief period in the late 1840s, early 1850s, where it was, believe it or not, a private residence, but it has been maintained and used as the parish church. And we still have Mass there today. We have Mass every Sunday at 5 o'clock. We have weddings, baptisms, funerals. I mean, it is part of the community, and it has been since the 18th century.
What people might remember it for was not there during the time period we are talking about. It's the beautiful fresco ceiling.
Mm-hmm. The fresco was painted in 1946 by Antonio Garcia. It depicts the Annunciation. So you have the angel Gabriel telling Mary about the coming birth of Christ. The neat thing about it, I think anyway, is that Mr. Garcia painted it to take place in South Texas. So if you look behind Gabriel, you'll see a little white mission-looking church, and that is Our Lady of Loretto Chapel. It's part of the painting. There's a rattlesnake, there's cactus. I mean, you can look at it and tell he was depicting Texas.
And he's known as the Michelangelo of South Texas.
He is.
The Presidio is known as the crossroads of revolution because of how many movements it survived.
Yes. So it was built as a military position, fortification. It was a strong position to hold. It was close to the coast. And so during the early 19th century, most all of the filibustering expeditions that came into Texas looked at the Presidio. They wanted to capture it. They wanted to hold it. It was key to the plans here. The first time it's captured is by Gutierrez and McGee's forces in 1812. They hold it for 4 months. The Spanish army surrounds it. They're unable to drive the filibusters out. Eventually, the Spanish army breaks away. Gutierrez and McGee follow them. It's a whole different story. But then you have successive filibustering expeditions that come through. Henry Perry comes through in 1817. James Long shows up in 1819. He actually takes over the Presidio in 1821. He holds it for about 4 or 5 days. I'm not sure how he was able to hold it that long. The locals were getting on the roofs of their house and firing into the fort on Long. But the pirate Lafitte, who had been supplying Long, had shared information about Long taking over the fort. The Spanish army knew what was going on. They showed up, surrounded it, captured him. He surrendered. He was taken away in chains, and the fort was not active again until the Texas period, the revolutionary period that we talk about today.
And a few more interesting facts. It's the most fought over fort in Texas history, participating in 6 national revolutions or wars for independence.
Mm-hmm. And it was key to the Spanish control of Texas. They sent expeditions from Presidio la Bahía out all over the countryside. So there was kind of a route that would be operated. The troopers from La Bahía and the troopers from Bear would patrol between there and Nacogdoches and back down. But the Presidial troopers from La Bahía would actually run up and down the coast. They reported back when the French exiles showed up in 1817 to establish their colony. They picked up shipwrecked Acadians and Germans in the 1760s. I mean, they were pretty active in Texas the whole time that fort was there.
Well, now that we've established the setting, let's dive into the Texas Revolution. Last week on the podcast, we talked about the Battle of Coleto Creek. What happened after Fannin and his Texan forces surrendered?
The first thing that happens is the Mexican army disarms the Texians. They take up all the weaponry that the enlisted men had been using. There was a pretty large shipment of muskets that Fannin had taken before they left the Presidio. So each man probably had not only his personal weapon, but had access to 2, sometimes 3 other weapons. So General Urrea talks about this. He says almost every man had like 3 to 4 guns with him. They take up all the swords from the Texian officers, and they send the prisoners back from Coleto Creek to the fort that they had just left the day before, back to Presidio la Bahía, or at the time the Texians called it Fort Defiance. They sent them back there. The wounded were kept on the battlefield for another day or so before they were sent back. And initially, all the Texian prisoners were held inside Our Lady of Loretto Chapel. But pretty early on, the men that weren't wounded and were able to get up, move around, that sort of thing, they were taken out of the chapel, and the chapel housed the wounded Texians and Mexicans. So it served as a hospital. Today, there is a baptistry right when you walk into the chapel, and that served as Fannin's quarters, and a couple of the Texian doctors, they were all quartered up into that room, and that's where they stayed while they were there.
The prisoners thought they were going to be set free.
They did. General Holsinger, who was a German serving in the Mexican army, had made the comment to the Texians that, you're going to be going home pretty soon. And so everybody was pretty excited about that. The mood wasn't the greatest when they got to the fort, but they still had that little bit of hope that they were holding on to, that they would be held as prisoners for a while, but eventually sent back to the United States.
But there's disagreement on the Mexican side about how to move forward.
The Mexican officers received orders from Santa Anna that the Texians were to be treated as prisoners under the Tornel Decree. And the Tornel Decree basically says that any foreigners that are captured under arms, fighting against the Mexican government, are to be treated as pirates and treated accordingly. And Santa Anna sends the orders down to General Urrea that he wants these prisoners taken out and shot. He says it's the law, this is what we're going to do. Urrea is not really excited about that. Whether it was just his distaste over the whole idea of executing these men, or whether it had something to do with his Federalist leanings, which is how the Texas Revolution gets started, over the Federalist versus Centralist sort of thing. I'm not completely sure what it was, but Urrea wasn't happy about this, so he put the order off. Now, also, Urrea is not there on the ground with the Texians. He has moved on from the Coleto Creek battlefield towards Victoria. He actually captures some more of the Texians, Ward's men, who we left at Refugio. They've shown up in Victoria to meet up with Fannin. They run into the Mexican army. They're captured. They're sent back over toward Goliad. And Urrea is trying to stall this. He doesn't know how to completely disobey Santa Anna's order, but he's trying to stall this. And Urrea's not the only one. Colonel Portilla's not excited about it. Garay, who was an officer in the Mexican army. These guys just don't want to take men that they'd fought who surrendered honorably. They just don't want to take them out and shoot them. So it's an unpopular idea.
Honor's a big thing in this time period,
exactly.
too. So Santa Anna repeatedly orders Urrea and Lieutenant Colonel Portilla to execute them. And as you said, this is kind of a decision that's keeping them up at night, that they're pondering this. What happens next?
It definitely is weighing heavily on Urrea's mind. He actually uses words like harsh and horrible spectacle when he talks about the idea of this massacre. And he actually uses the term massacre. He calls it a massacre. I know there's some debate over whether it's an execution or a massacre. So basically, he continues this push to stall. What happens is Santa Anna goes straight to Portilla, who is at La Bahía, and says, made this order, you're going to carry it out. And Portilla is so upset about it that he hides it. He says, look, I'm keeping this secret. I'm not telling anybody about this. I don't want this word getting out. We got to figure out what to do. And these two men continue to stall this, even though Santa Anna's pushing it.
Fannin is telling his men that the Mexicans are making arrangements to free them. So there is still hope on the Texan side.
Mm-hmm. Like I said, as far as the Texians are concerned, they're probably going to be sent back to the United States. Fannin travels down to Copano with Chadwick, who was his aide-de-camp, and they're trying to secure passage on ships to go back to the United States. While this is going on in the background, the Mexican officers are talking about this order that Santa Anna sent down. There's also this front, anyway, to keep the Texians thinking that they are going to be sent off and sent home and not shot. And the Texians still don't know that this order has been sent down to take them all out and shoot them.
Something that's really chilling, they didn't know it was their last night on Earth, but the night before this massacre, March 26th, they sing a song called Home Sweet Home, which implies they think they're going home.
They think they're going home. Fannin is actually talking to one of the other Texians about his wife and children the night before they're taken out. I mean, these guys really do think that it's going to turn out all right for them.
On Palm Sunday, March 27th, 1836, Portilla does end up carrying out those execution orders. Describe the harrowing journey they faced on their way to death.
So the Texians, as a group, all the men that can, that are able to stand up, walk, march, that sort of thing, they're all taken outside of the gates of the Presidio. They're split into 3 groups, and they're started in 3 different directions outside of the fort. They go about half a mile, 3/4 of a mile away. One of them goes upriver. One of the groups goes downriver towards the lower crossing, and one is marched out towards a cattle pen. The Texians think that they're headed home. One of the Texians actually writes, one of the survivors says, we were told we were going to go round up cattle. We needed food, so we were going to go round up cattle. So they start out, they get about, like I said, 3/4 of a mile or so out, and the Mexican army halts the Texians. They had been on either side of the Texians to kind of keep them in control. They had to call them sort of surrounded by Mexican guards. The one line of guards steps through the Texians over to the other side. The Mexican army then turns, level their muskets on the Texians, and they fire into them, and they massacre these men. The Texians didn't know this was coming. They thought that they were headed home. From the accounts I've read, the 2 groups that were marched off towards the river, I think maybe some of those guys kind of got the idea what was about to happen, but we do know the ones that were marched into the cattle pen figured it out really quick. They realized that this is not right. They're marched into a pen. The Mexican army has them corralled in, and they level their muskets and fire into them. And at that point, well over 300 men are being fired on by the Mexican army all at the same time.
Even if you are in that group that's being surrounded in the cattle pen, is there anything you can do to fight back at that point?
Not really. Some of the men, they start to kind of cry. They start to say, pray, what have you. Some of the men are like, no, stand up, stand strong, be tough. There's nothing we can do, but we're not going to go down like cowards. The weird thing about this is even with the point blank range that these men were fired on, not everybody is hit outright. Some of the men are standing there and their friends go down around them, but they don't get hit. So they turn it. In fact, in the cattle pen, one of the guys says he turns and runs and jumps up the wall and climbs over and makes his escape. Some of the Texians that were down by the river weren't hit in the immediate volley, and they make their way to the river and they start to escape. They dive in and swim across. One of the Texians is not shot or not hit severely. It's not a serious wound, but he is hit, but one of his friends falls on top of him and the musket round knocks him out, I guess. He's knocked unconscious. And when he comes to, he's been stripped naked and left for dead, but he survived. So he gets up and takes off. So there's a lot of really wild things that are going on at this point.
Was there any historical significance of this taking place on Palm Sunday, or is that just the date it happened to fall on?
I don't know of any historical significance. I think it was just when they were taken out to do it, when the order, I think it was because of Santa Ana pushing that order to be carried out. Yeah, and it's like, it's time to do it.
There were Texans who were sick and injured who stayed behind in the chapel, but their lives were not spared.
No, the order from Santa Ana applied to everyone. And so the Texans that were wounded were physically drug out of the chapel, and they were either shot or bayoneted where they lay. There were a few that were kept behind for specific purposes to help with the surgeons, that sort of thing. One of them actually mentions how he walks out and finds the wounded men just laying where they'd been drug out and that they had been shot and bayoneted there. So there, as far as Santa Ana was concerned, there was no way to get out of this. It was all or none.
So the final death toll, as far as we know, more than 300 Texans killed in the massacre.
Right around 342 is the historic figure that we have.
James Fannin had to watch his men get executed, and then he too met his fate. Before he was killed, he made a few requests. What were those requests, and did the Mexican troops follow them?
So according to Joseph Spahn, who was with Fannin when he was executed, Fannin offered a gold pocket watch that belonged to his wife to an officer, I think in an effort to get a proper burial. And the officer pocketed the watch and took it. Fannin then was blindfolded, and he could hear the soldiers moving in close to him. And he asked that he not be shot so close that the powder burned his body. The Mexican officer that was in charge of the detail had his men remove their bayonets. They unfixed their bayonets. They moved into what Spahn says was around 2 feet away, and they fired right into Fannin, right on top of him. So Fannin had asked for a proper burial. He'd asked that his body basically not be mutilated by the gunfire at that close a range, and both of those requests were denied. Fannin fell out of his chair. His body rolled into one of the defensive ditches that men had dug a couple of weeks before, and he was later just taken out with the rest of the men and treated all as all the same.
As you said, there were survivors. Some people managed to get away, but there was a woman named the Angel of Goliad. Who is she?
She was the wife of one of the Mexican officers. We believe her name was Francita Alvarez. There's actually here in San Antonio several descendants of the Angel of Goliad. She knew it was going to happen. The word had gotten through the Mexican ranks about Santa Ana's orders, and she went around and did the best she could to save mainly the younger guys, the men that were in the younger Texans that were in their teens, late teens, maybe early 20s. She saved several of them. She actually hid them. She hid some behind doors. She hid some under piles of canvas and bagging and things like that. But she did what she could to hide them in. And she was also instrumental in saving some of Ward's men when they were brought back in after they were captured at Victoria. So she's known as the Angel of Goliad today.
Do we know how many people she saved?
I don't have an exact count on that. It's one of those things that's kind of hard. Like a
Hard
lot
to
of what
pin
we've
down.
discussed, it's kind of hard to pin down.
What happened to the bodies of the people killed in the massacre? Were they burned in a pyre like here at the Alamo?
They were. The problem with the funeral pyre at La Bahía is the wood was green, so the bodies weren't entirely consumed when they were burned. One of the Texian survivors that is kept inside the walls of the fort and is tending to wounded and helping with chores that the Mexican army needs help with. He talks about walking out and seeing the remains of the Texians, and he says it's bones that he can see, but they're held together by tendon. The thought is that the flames weren't hot enough to entirely consume the bodies, but they burned them for the most part. There are accounts that mention multiple fires. It was one of those things, one of those details that I'd like to be able to nail down for sure. Were there multiple funeral pyres? Was there just one? It seems like there were multiple pyres, but yeah, they were burned to consume the bodies as best as they could.
Executions, by their very nature, send a message. What was the intended message during the Texas Revolution?
So the message is obviously don't fight for Texas independence. This is an echo of what Santa Ana witnessed in 1813 under General Arredondo's command when the Spanish army drove the filibusters out after Gutierrez and McGee's forces had come through. Arredondo rounded up everybody in San Antonio that had all the males that had supported that independence movement and systematically executed them. And Santa Ana's doing the same thing. He says, don't come here and fight for independence. And it's a pretty chilling message to send, and it's a really dark way to do it. But that was what Santa Ana knew. That was the way he'd come up through the military.
The famous poet Walt Whitman wrote about the Goliad Massacre. How did the story trickle down to him, and how did he incorporate it into his work?
I knew Walt Whitman had written the poem. I didn't know a whole lot of the backstory on it, and it's very interesting. Some people think that he might have been influenced by Herman Ehrenberg's account of the Goliad Massacre and the Goliad campaign of 1836. Ehrenberg, I think it was first published in 42, and I want to say it was republished in 46 or 48, but some people think that, that came out about the time he was writing this, that he might have seen that. The Mexican-American War is taking place right around the same time he writes these poems, and this one in particular, so there's a lot of interest in what's going on or what had been going on in Texas in 1836. And then there's also a letter from a Mexican officer, supposedly from a Mexican officer, that had witnessed the massacre. And that letter had made its way back into the print and the press back east and had resurfaced around this time. And so there's a lot of thought about what could have influenced Walt Whitman to write that poem. As far as what really it was, what the catalyst was, I don't know if it was just one or if it was the whole thing combined that really influenced him for that.
Clearly made an impact. Mm-hmm. Now, since the Texas Revolution, Presidio la Bahía has been restored a few times. And I really like this line from the website about why rebellions and time were the main enemies. What would you have seen from March of 1836 on? Was it in ruins at that point?
That's another period that we're trying to do more research on. I know that when the Mexican army captured the Alamo, one of the things that they did was they dismantled the defenses while they were here so that the Texans couldn't make use of it. I have a strong suspicion they did the same thing at Goliad. By 1846, you have people traveling through that talk about the fort being in ruins. I don't think it fell apart that quick on its own. I think that was kind of sped along by probably the Mexican army. Goliad probably looked like a desolate wasteland after March of 1836. The Texans had done a really good job clearing out what existed of the Villa of La Bahía that grew up around the wall. So they tore down the houses, they burned down the houses, they just destroyed everything that they could because they wanted a clear field of fire. The Mexican army probably did a pretty good job of destroying what was left as far as the defensive positions. The church wasn't touched. The church was the parish church, and even though the villagers, the Badeños, had left, that was not harmed during this time. But yeah, Goliad would have been a pretty good wasteland by the time that Rusk shows back up in late May, early June of 1836. And of course, you've also got the remains of the Texians. We mentioned the funeral pyre. There were some remains the Mexican army buried in shallow graves. The community of La Bahía had abandoned the town site during the war. Obviously, they didn't want to get caught between the Texian and Mexican forces, so they packed up and left. The dogs that they left behind, the coyotes and wolves on the prairies had come into town and dug up the remains of the Texians so that when Rusk comes through with the Texian army, as they're following the retreat of the Mexican army, they find the scattered, partially consumed remains of the Texians that had died during the massacre. So Goliad would have been a really dark place to have been in at that time.
More than a century later, in 1963, that's a year of rebirth with a lot of historic preservation, archaeological excavation.
Yeah, so this is a more exciting, happier time for the Presidio. Ms. Catherine O'Connor gets together. She is a descendant of Thomas O'Connor, who signed the first Declaration of Texas Independence at Presidio la Bahía. I do have to get that dig in at Washington on the Brazos because we declared independence first. But she is a descendant of one of the signers, and he'd been involved with the early garrison there. She wanted to restore the Presidio to what it looked like in 1836. She got together with a fellow by the name of Rayford Stripling. He was a graduate from Texas A&M, and he had worked with Roland Beard on the restoration or reconstruction of the mission there in Goliad. So that was back in the 30s. So he comes back 30 years later, and he works on the Presidio. And by that point, he had fine-tuned his skills with restoration. He'd studied more, and he was able to pick up the walls had fallen down in places, but they were piles of rubble, but there was still a base underneath those piles. He was able to rebuild the walls right on top of the original footings. They actually dug down underneath all of the footings and poured concrete to stabilize them. They put the roofs back on the barracks, the officers' quarters, the whole 9 yards, and they reconstructed They literally reconstructed the walls that had fallen down, and they restored Presidio la Bahía to what it would have looked like in 1836.
Today, Presidio la Bahía is operated by the Texas Historical Commission. If people are coming to the Alamo and want to make the road trip down there, what are they going to see?
You're going to get to see the only fully restored Presidio in the entire United States. They used to say west of the Mississippi, but the fort over in San Augustine, Florida is not technically a Presidio. So I'm gonna bump that up and say it's the only fully restored Presidio in the United States. It is the only place you can go and see a restored Presidio and a mission the way that they existed in the same footprint that they existed in the 18th century. So that's unique. We have series of exhibits that talk about the Presidio from its earliest beginnings up through the Texas Revolution. One of the things that I think is unique about our site is all the artifacts that you see were dug up on site. So we don't have artifacts brought in from somewhere else that are from the right period or that are somewhat related. It came out of the ground there. Somebody used it from 1836 on back, and we have it out for display. We have Our Lady of Loretto Chapel, which was completed in 1779. It's still an active chapel today. We still have weddings, funerals, baptisms, all that. It's an active church. You get to see that. It's one of the oldest vaulted ceilings that you'll see still around in Texas.
You get more than 33,000 visitors each year.
Yes.
And some can even spend the night in the quarters. What does that mean?
Used to be the priest quarters where the Catholic priest used to live when he attended Mass at the Presidio there. You can stay overnight. There is a queen bed, 2 twins, little living room area, private kitchenette, and you have access to the fort. So you can go out, walk around the grounds in the evening, watch the sunset over the battlements. It's really popular, and it's a unique experience. It's not every day you get to go stay in an 18th century Spanish fort.
For sure. Remember the Alamo is a battle cry known around the world, but it wasn't spoken on its own. Those soldiers at San Jacinto also shouted, "Remember Goliad." What can we take away from what happened in Goliad and its place in Texas history?
The Goliad campaign, the Goliad Massacre, the fall of Presidio la Bahía, it's been kind of overshadowed by the bookend events of the Texas Revolution, the fall of the Alamo and the victory at San Jacinto. But it's key to at least the victory at San Jacinto. The battle cry is remember the Alamo, remember La Bahía. The Texians that fought at San Jacinto had lost friends and family at both places, the Alamo and Goliad, but had lost friends and family at Goliad, and that helped to carry them across the field to victory that day. It's a very special story. You've got a lot of key figures from the Texas Revolution that passed through the gates of the Presidio, Sam Houston, Jim Bowie, Dimmitt, Fannin, all those guys, they're all there. And without what took place there in March of 1836, you might not have had the victory at San Jacinto, a month later with what took place there on April 21st.
Scott McMahon, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Be sure to check out the podcast notes. We have linked to Presidio la Bahia's website so you can see photos of the famous site, explore more of its history, and even plan a visit. You've been listening to Stories Bigger Than Texas, the Alamo Podcast.